Hi, this is Chris Wysopal. Some of you might know me as Weld Pond from the Loft, and this is Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker, and today we have episode 418 for March 3rd, 2025. And as you have probably surmised at this point, we'll be talking with Weld Pond, aka Chris Wysopal, one of the original founders of the L0pht Heavy Industries hacking group. And we've got a great, fun discussion for you today. Just a couple quick lingo things before we get into the interview. I threw this one out without thinking about it. IRL. If you're young enough, you probably know that means in real life. That's what that stands for. But we talk about 2600, which is a classic hacker, I guess, e-zine, as an electronic magazine that's been around since the early days. And actually, Emmanuel Goldstein, I think, who started that at least, is somebody I would love to interview someday. And you can still find a lot of this online if you go to 2600.com, like literally the number 2600.com. Which, of course, is a callback to phone phreaking, the 2600 hertz frequency used to hack phone routing. We also talk about the NSA here a little bit because there's a great, funny story. Space Rogue talked about this like a little bit last year when we talked to him, who is also from the Loft. And it was his book that alerted me to this story. But I wanted to get Weld's take on this as well, and he's got a nice, funny twist to that story. But we talk about the NSA, which for many, many years was classified to the point where it wasn't even, acknowledged that it existed. So some people took to calling it no such agency instead of the National Security Agency. At one point, he throws out POCSAG. That's POCSAG. That stands for Post Office Code Standardization Advisory Group. But it's basically just the protocol used in the old days for pager data. And then finally, we talk about war driving a little bit, which is another kind of a hacker history thing about kind of driving around and trying to map out the various Wi-Fi signals. This was much more popular back in the day when Wi-Fi was really new. And it came from the concept of war dialing, which came from the movie War Games, where Matthew Broderick's character sets up his computer to just dial all the numbers that are local long enough to answer and find out if it was a human or if it was a machine at the other end to map out where potential hackable computers might be. Anyway, that's what war driving is. See, there's so many cool things about hacker culture and hacker history. That's why I love talking with some of the OG hackers to get these stories, because they're just absolutely fascinating. And there's so many fun pop culture crossovers both ways between the hacker culture and regular pop culture. So anyway, with that as a setup, let's get to the interview with Weld Pond, aka Chris Wysopal. In the 1990s, Weld Pond, aka Chris Wysopal, was one of the original vulnerability researchers at the Loft, a hacker think tank, where he was one of the first to publicize the risks of insecure software. Today, Chris is the chief security evangelist at Veracode, a company he co-founded with fellow Loft member Dildog. He's an author, a speaker, and a true OG hacker. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Hi, Kerry. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, I met you very briefly, and I bet you don't remember this. You did a panel discussion at DEF CON for, I think, another anniversary. There's been a lot of anniversaries being celebrated, 20 anniversaries and such.
We're getting old.
Yeah. And I walked up and I said, hey, Anna, would you like to do this? He said, yeah. And I don't think you remember that. But I did get a chance to see you at SmooCon. That's when we set this up. So I was really glad we got a chance to meet. I got a lot of stuff I want to talk about, and we're going to have some fun. We're going to go down some memory lane. So I want to start with some basics. I know I interviewed Space Rogue, so we've covered this a little bit before. But give me a quick recap of how L0pht started, maybe how you got into the L0pht hacker group.
Yes, the L0pht started, and this is something fairly unique about sort of the hackers in the Boston area and just at that time. It started as a physical space, and that's why it's called the Loft, which is,
because it was a loft, L0pht, yeah.
It was an actual loft. It was an old manufacturing building in the south end of Boston. And the thing that, I think in the Boston community was fairly unique, and what I feel lucky to have been there at that time was there was, physical meetups where people would meet each other in person. And it wasn't just online. It wasn't just all bulletin boards, which is the way people communicated at the time, we met up in person, and you get to know people better, and you start to feel like, hey, maybe I could share a space with these people. So when the loft started, it was really Brian Oblivion and Count Zero, who were, part of the hacker scene in Boston. They were friends. They lived together in the South End, and they had a physical space that they had access to because their wives had started this hat making business or hat decorating business. And, it actually makes perfect sense for a loft space in the South End. It's kind of fashion area for things like dressmaking and stuff. And it turned out that they couldn't afford the full space. So they invited Count Zero and Brian to say, do you want to share the space with us, split the rent with us? And they started moving all their computer equipment in there. And it just became, hey, this is really cool. We have this loft space and we're starting to fill it up with computer equipment. And they filled up half the space. And it turns out that Mary Oblivion, Brian's wife, and Count Zero's wife, decided to exit the hat making business. It just wasn't working out the way they wanted to. And this led to an opportunity. Now they had double the space. They liked the idea of a communal space where they could share resources. They could share a workbench together with a soldering iron and maybe share a modem together. And they invited people that they had met at these different meetups, like the 2600 meetup, the Works meetup, which was a bulletin board. And I was lucky enough to be someone that they thought, this guy could collaborate with us. He could contribute. And that was sort of the criteria. Obviously you need to be able to split the rent, but they wanted people that, could help out. It wasn't supposed to be just a pure, like, drink beers and watch TV kind of space. It was like, let's do projects together. Let's do cool stuff together. And so there was sort of like, you needed to have some skills,
Yeah. Well, and I remember, when Luke and Death Vig and Omega were talking about this, you mentioned the area code lottery and growing up someplace where they actually had local bulletin boards, because back then long distance calls cost a lot of money. So if you could make a local call and get on a BBS, that was huge. And then second, of course, was you probably had a father who had some reason to have a computer and a modem critically that you could have access to that got you online.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I was lucky enough to live in 617, which is the Boston metro area. We all know that, Boston today and Boston then was like a hotbed of technology, software companies, et cetera. And I was lucky enough to have a father who bought me a computer. He didn't buy it for himself and let me use it. He actually bought it for me.
Oh, nice.
Because I told him I wanted to go to college for computer engineering, and that if I had my own computer, this would be great. I could do my homework on my computer instead of going to the computing center. So it was sort of like halfway through freshman year of college. He's like, yeah, we should get a computer. And it was just mine, right? So I could have it in my bedroom. I could use it all the time, which meant late at night I could dial up bulletin boards. So I feel very lucky to both be in a good zip code, good area code, and also have early access to a real computer.
Back in the day, it sounds like most of you would interact through the bulletin boards, and IRC, I guess, was later. But I imagine that being together must have really changed the dynamic. Like, for example, when you guys were hanging out together, did you still, like when you were out having pizza, were you still going by your hacker names to each other? Did you realize when you finally got together, oh, I know you from high school or something like that? The dynamic must be different when you actually have the chance to meet IRL.
Yeah, so even in real life, we still used our hacker names, because that way it was really easy to connect what was online, what you were doing online with what was in real life. And, I knew the real names of a few people, but, it just didn't matter. I knew them as their hacker names. So when we would, go out for beers and pizza after the 2600 meeting, we famously started this 2621 meeting for those of us who were old enough that, of course, we're still using our hacker names over pizza and beer.
You guys collected a lot of stuff in this loft space. I was read Chris's book about, Space Rogue's book about this, and he was telling me about all the stuff you guys had. It almost sounded like one of the very first maker spaces almost, because you guys had so much random stuff in there. But apparently you got a lot of this stuff from dumpster diving. So And you were credited with getting a Spark motherboard, which sounds like you might want to dispute, but I mean, those were not cheap back in the day. But I'm really curious. I want to take us back to like a dumpster dive run. Like, how did that work? How did you know where to go? What were you looking for? And like, what were some of the most amazing things you found in a dumpster?
Yeah, so dumpster diving is fun if you're dumpster diving in the right place. Like if it's your sort of your standard office building, almost every bag you're opening up has coffee grounds in it, right? It's just
Sure.
it's just a mess, right? And someone's lunch. But if you're in the right places where it's like not next to a regular office, it's next to like a lab or a manufacturing building, it starts to skew more towards interesting hardware and things like that. So dumpster diving was a lot of fun, and being in the Boston Cambridge area, Cambridge was just a real hotbed. Like dumpster diving at MIT was one of the best places because they had such interesting equipment and they were always getting new stuff in, and they would just throw out the old stuff. Or the different, there's a lot of biotech in that area. So I ended up dumpster diving some really interesting medical equipment one day, which, now that I look back on it, I'm like, what was I doing in a dumpster that had like centrifuges in it and EKG machines?
That would get you on a list today, I'm sure.
Yeah, and like, who knows if there was broken glass or needles in there? I don't know.
Sure.
So I look back on it, and it's the sort of the foolhardiness of youth, right? Now, ignorance is bliss. But I got some really cool stuff. So like we built computers out of this stuff, or we would just get fun things to take apart and understand. Like, like how many people have access to take apart an EKG machine, right?
Sure,
it's just like it's just interesting technology. It's like you strap it onto your body and it reads signals on your skin and it transcribes those. The one I found was a paper tape. So you learn a lot, and this is really the hacking way. You learn a lot by just taking things apart and trying to figure it out. It's just a completely different mindset for understanding how something works, as opposed to reading a manual or even like design documentation, right? There's just a total another factor, and you just learn reverse engineering. You start to learn how to understand how things work by taking them apart, as opposed to reading how they were built.
Yeah, well, in documentation, I mean, we take it for granted today because you're like, oh, I missed my manual, type manual.pdf, and you just get it. Like someone's got it somewhere. Back in the day, documentation could be very hard to come by, and I'm sure I think you guys found a lot of it, very interesting documentation too in these dumpster dives, didn't you?
Totally. So yes. Part of the reason the loft was a physical space, and part of the reason that was successful is we had a library, right? So everyone shared their books and they shared their manuals that they got. So some of it was just sort of out of corporate closets, right? Like, we're throwing away our manuals, or we're clearing out this closet of old manuals, and we would just take them. Others you could only find by dumpster diving because it was essentially restricted to just the people that owned. A lot of this stuff is restricted to people that own that particular technology. So imagine like dumpster diving at the phone company, right? How else are you going to get manuals of how SS7 works, or some other kind of phone switch works, or some sort of AT&T operating system? So dumpster diving was the only way to get at some of the information that was out there.
All right, so I want to bring back one story that came from the book that I want to get your take on, and that was your trip famously to the 1998 Senate testimony with Fred Thompson. I always, whenever I see that clip, I still think Law and Order, but which I can't remember which he did first. But anyway, you guys are on the way there, and you had some strange van you rented and put all sorts of radio equipment on, and ended up you're going to the National Cryptologic Museum, which is the NSA's museum, which seems like a funny thing. No such agency has a museum, but you went to go visit the museum but turned in the wrong spot. Give me your take on that story. And I'm also curious, what were you looking for with the SIGINT? What kind of signals were you hunting for?
Yeah. So when we got invited to speak at the Senate, there was 7 of us. So, and no one had a car big enough. And I said, well, why don't we rent a van and drive down? That'll be more fun than flying. And and the Senate was going to reimburse us, so we could have flown down, but we thought it would be just more fun to go down together in a van. And, DC isn't that far from Boston to drive. And so I rented this 14-passenger van. I think it was a Dodge Ram van. It was quite big, and it was dark green, and it had tinted black windows, so it just sort of looked cool. Like it almost looked like a government vehicle. And then we put antennas on the top because at the time, Wi-Fi was brand new. I don't even know if Bluetooth was out yet, but we were, there's all kinds of digital data signals, pager signals and things like that we were interested in capturing and decoding. The L0pht actually shipped as a product the POCSAG decoder kit. POCSAG is an acronym that stands for, it specifies a pager protocol. And we actually made a little kit that you could attach to a radio, a scanner, and decode pager messages. So this was something that we would be using on the way down to watch pager traffic on the way down. And people don't realize
were you war driving kind of too? Was that a thing you guys did?
War driving was, it was just on the cusp of war driving. Like that term hadn't been made yet, but yeah, we definitely had Wi-Fi radios, which were also brand new for a laptop back then. So we're driving down, and we took a route that would take us by the NSA's Cryptologic Museum because why not? We heard they had Enigma machines there, and we could just see a lot of the old crypto gear that was very mechanical and just a cool thing to do. And so I just had to paint the scene a little bit because what happens is a little crazy. So we're driving down in this van. It's dark green with tinted windows, and the two guys in the front seat are relatively clean cut looking. Like Space Rogue was former military. He's got a buzz cut on. He always wears sunglasses when he's driving. And the other guy, Stefan, who was actually driving at the time, again, short hair, mirror shade, sunglasses. And so we're driving down the highway, and we see the sign that says NSA Cryptologic Museum up ahead. And then there's another sign, and it says NSA Employee Entrance right off the highway. And I think Stefan got something confused, and he just drives off the highway right into the employee entrance of the NSA. And he's driving, and he's kind of hesitating a little bit at the gate. And I just have to, picture this. This is a military base. The NSA is part of the Department of Defense. So it's got a guard shack, big gate with barbed wire on the top, and people standing outside with automatic weapons. And the gate was open. It just happened to be open. Maybe they were waiting for someone, the next car, who knows? And they just waved us in to the employee parking lot. So we just drive right through. And this is when us in the back seat, which are kind of heads down, and Space Rogue was probably looking down on his computer, even in the front seat, and kind of said, what just happened? Like, where are we? And we look around, and we're on the inside of the fence. And the first thing we say is, we have to get out of here. Like, if we get stopped and they start questioning us, this is going to take a while. And so we turned around, went a loop around the parking lot, and just drove out again. And luckily, no one stopped us, asked for ID. It was just the most bizarre incident.
That's hilarious.
And I think we were a little bit worried that, for the moment, like, what if we get stopped and we can't even make our hearing in the morning?
It sounds like the classic, like, put on an orange vest and either carry around a clipboard or a ladder, and like no one will stop you. You just look the part. Into the NSA headquarters. It's just kind of crazy. So it's funny you mentioned the hair thing, because I went back and watched your DEF CON 20-year anniversary of that testimony, and it was so hilarious that both you and Mudge brought wigs to try to make your hair look like it looked back then. That was hilarious. Okay, so you did celebrate that in 2018, and I think you did something in DC, but the thing I caught was the DEF CON panel. So I'm curious, looking back, after all these years, what lasting impact do you think that testimony had? And then as kind of a follow-up, how has the relationship changed between, let's say specifically Congress, not government in general, but like the congressional relationship with hacking groups? Have you continued, have groups continued to testify? Have they been heard out? Have they been asked good questions?
Yeah, I think the biggest lasting change was that, people that are, independent researchers, self-taught, they're part of the hacker culture, have very important things to say, and their opinions matter when it comes to cybersecurity. It really changed from, you needed to be an authority, you needed to be working at a software company or working for the government to be someone to be listened to. Because, just the fact that the Senate wanted to listen to us. They had Peter Neumann there, who was a senior researcher at SRI, which is basically a government-funded think tank. They had the Office of Budget and Management, which I guess, no, not Office of Budget Management. It was whatever the Congressional Audit Office is.
GAO, Government Accountability Office.
They had GAO there, which basically was a bunch of compliance people. So they had these other authorities, and then we were there as peers with them. And I think the lasting impact was, these people from this ilk should be part of the discussion. They have that adversarial mindset. They have taken the stuff apart. They know things that the people who built it don't know. And we need to be listening to them. And I'm very happy that I was one of the first to sort of start that dialogue, which has, I think, really, really continued to today. The government now goes to DEF CON. They started
Spot
going.
the Fed,
now,
yeah, right.
Now it's like not just spot the Fed. It's like, hey, we're speaking here.
Right.
We want to interface and dialogue with you officially, not just sort of like in the audience pretending we're here. It's like we're accepted now.
Well, and so I guess I want to hear this story too. I think this was in the book, in Space Rogue's book. This call came about, I think, because of the Richard Clarke visit to the L0pht, right? He saw what you guys were up to, was blown away by what you guys were able to do on basically a shoestring budget. And didn't that lead to this? And how did you guys ever get in touch with Richard Clarke in the first place?
Yeah, so it's all a little fuzzy. Because, I think Richard Clarke reached out to Mudge and said, I want to meet with you guys. And so this is even before the Senate testimony. So it's like, what is this? This guy works for the National Security Council. He's the head of counterterrorism, the deputy national security advisor for counterterrorism. Like, it sounds like he's pretty important and he wants to talk to us. So the whole thing sounded a little bit strange, and we were a little hesitant to do it. But we looked him up, and he was from the Boston area. He was a graduate of Boston College High School, and he had his master's degree from MIT. And we're like, yeah, this guy seems like legit. Like, he might actually understand what we're talking about, and it seems possible. He's not a lawyer. He's not a cop from the FBI. So we decided to meet at John Harvard's, which was an early brew pub. I mean, this was around like 1997 in Harvard Square. They made their own beer. And I remember that when we went there, we sat in the back, and Richard Clarke was sitting at the bar.
That's right.
And Mudge, I don't think he knew, like, Richard Clarke didn't know what Mudge looked like. So Mudge just kind of went up to the bar and just started chit-chatting with him to sort of see what this guy was all about. And then, like, after 5 minutes, he goes, "Oh, and I want to let you know I'm Mudge from the L0pht, and you're coming to meet." So there was this little standoffishness in the beginning, but quickly we all sat down at a round table, ordered some drinks and food, and he was throwing questions at us. He's like, "Well, you guys work at, some of us worked at BBN, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which is like a early internet backbone company and an internet technology company, built some of the first routers. You guys do IT there. What do you think about, Tivoli? Like, what do you think about some of the system administration tools that have agents running on every computer, and you can control them from one machine?" And we're like, that sounds very scary to us. And from what we know about software, Tivoli probably has a whole bunch of vulnerabilities in it, especially back in 97. But, that stuff is hard to get access to, right? Like hackers don't have really good access to that stuff because it's so expensive. You can't download it there's no free copy or free trial. And a lot of these enterprise tools were really fragile because they hadn't been exposed to hacker impact, right? And so, we were sort of bridging that gap, starting to hear from him. These are things we kind of got like the federal government's concerned about these tools because he's asking us, what do you think about these? And, we're giving our best opinion, but we're also learning from him too. Like, what does he care about? So it was an interesting collaboration. We were really learning from each other. But I think the thing you mentioned where they kind of learned from us a lot was when we took them back to the loft. So we got to know each other, and it turned out that even though we had dinner with Richard Clarke, he did have a second guy with him. He wasn't going to go back to the loft alone, and I can only imagine this guy was packing. But we went back to the loft and gave them a tour, showed them, this is our hardware research area. We got radios, oscilloscopes, spectrum analyzers, soldering irons to take things apart and build things. This is where we do software. We have all this. We have Sun machines. We have DEC VAX machines. We have Windows. We have Mac. We showed them a small supercomputer that BVN was trashing, like it didn't work, and we brought it back to life. And he was. He was quite impressed, and we caught him and his colleague like over in the corner, kind of whispering to each other. And Mudge went over to them and said, excuse me, but we're in the same room here. Like, what is this whispering? Like, we brought you here. Let's have a conversation. And he says, well, I was just saying to my colleague here that we didn't know anyone could do this kind of thing on no budget. Like the capabilities you're showing us for like reverse engineering hardware, software across all these platforms, this supercomputer you've basically built, you've done this with no budget. Like you have no budget, right? And we said yes. And he really changed and showed them how asymmetrical cyber was going to be, that people could build up really good capabilities basically with no funding.
That's an amazing story. But yeah, that's funny how that all that came together. Hackers have had a history of fighting back against government and corporate overreach. I recall like legal clashes over things like DCSS, which allowed people to decrypt DVDs that they owned, by the way, and PGP, which allowed people to communicate securely around the world with strong encryption. And those were big legal battles. The companies, the corporate side of one part of that, and the government the other, was not happy with either of those projects. What were some of the more epic stories along those lines? I mean, those are a couple I can think of, but related to the last questions, how has the relationship between hackers and the man, in this case, I'm including like, big corporations and things like that. How has that evolved over the years as you had these struggles of, with them over things like this?
Yeah. So, part of the hacker ethos is, information wants to be free, right? So anytime, something is sort of locked up in an algorithm, or it's illegal to distribute certain things, the hacker inside of all of us starts to say, well, why? Like who is it harming? We're not talking about someone's personal information, their healthcare records, of course. We're talking about algorithms, right? We're talking about like you said, the raw DVD movie that you purchased, right? Or or software. Like why can't someone freely distribute software? We're not talking about stealing someone's commercial software. They're actually restricting software that you wrote from being distributed, or for you getting at the unencrypted data of something you bought, or for a lot of devices being able to interoperate with that device, like write your own piece of software that could control your garage door. Oh, I can't do that because the garage door can't be reverse engineered legally. And if I write software that does that, I'm breaking the law. So these things where things are off limits, which seem like they should be free game and fair to access, is really what causes hackers to want to come up with innovative ways to try to bypass it. And, one of those was there was an RSA algorithm that was, people have heard of the RSA cybersecurity company, Rivasmir and I forget the last
guy's name.
Adi?
But yes.
Adi, maybe?
RSA, yep.
They, three cryptographers started this company, and people don't remember the very first product was just selling crypto algorithms to places. And these were really strong, powerful crypto algorithms. And the federal government made exporting the RSA algorithm illegal. And it's like, well, this is crazy. Like, it's, you could print it out on a piece of paper. It's not that hard. And then someone said, well, you know what? I'm going to take that algorithm and I'm going to write it in 4 lines of Perl. So Perl is this older scripting language, but it has a lot of very complex operators in it. It's actually fairly powerful. And so someone wrote it in 4 lines of Perl. So people started using that as their footer on their email messages. Right? So it's like, hey, it's just a footer on my email message, and they would send emails in and out of the country. And it's like, well, is that exporting the algorithm? And it's like, well, I guess technically yes. And then someone said, well, I'm gonna one up the email, and I'm gonna physically print it out on a T-shirt and really make it a pure freedom of speech issue. Like, it's not even digital. We can't even claim it's software restriction. It's a T-shirt, and they made it machine readable by putting a barcode on it.
That's right. Yes.
And so you could have the algorithm printed on your T-shirt and have your barcode, and you could go in and out of the country with it. These were just proving the point that there's really no way to export control things like that. And, and this is just a hacker mentality. Like, I'll show you that you don't want this information to be free. I'll make it free. So that was just part of the culture back then. It wasn't all just like, a lot of people think of hackers as, hey, they figure out how to break into machines and they break into machines. But really, there's this whole ethos and culture of learning and reverse engineering and sort of, showing the man that, you can't stop us.
Yeah, and I know things like the CFFA, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act have been really thorns in the side of right to repair activists and other people who want to do these sorts of things. Where do things stand with that today? Because at this point, I know that there's these weird, every 3 years, the Library of Congress, allows certain things to not fall under these. It's a really weird process. Where do things stand in this fight between the corporations trying to make it impossible legally, not technically, but legally to do these things, and hackers getting away with it anyway? Yeah.
So when DCMCA came out, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, it was you couldn't reverse engineer anything that encrypted data if that data was copyrighted. So the idea was it extended the power of copyrighted data to, if it's encrypted, you can't look at it, right? You can't get at that. And so, this was really pushed by the people making DVDs. They're like, hey, people are ripping these CDs and they're making them in MP3s and they're putting them on their MP3 players and they're sharing them with their friends. Of course, this is all exactly what we did with tapes before, and they ended up taxing tapes and saying it's completely legal to, people forget this, it's completely legal to share music with your friends, because when they bought a blank tape, they paid for music to be shared on there, right?
Oh, yeah.
So the culture was, it's legal to share on tape, but why now it's not legal to be shared digitally? And it was really weird. There was a time, I don't know if you remember this, but there were audio CDRs and there were data CDRs. And the audio CDRs had the tax on them like the
I'd
tapes
forgotten about
did,
that.
and they were more expensive. Of course, no one bought them because they were exactly the same. All they did was have the tax. So you can see that this broke down when we got into the digital world. But you can see how sort of corporate America and the government are working together to figure out alternative ways to get the royalty paid by taxing audio tapes. So they didn't like the idea that people could rip CDs. So when DVDs came out, they said, well, we're going to have them encrypted. We're going to have a secret algorithm. And that secret algorithm is going to be copyright protected. So you can't have your own version of that algorithm, right? And you can't reverse engineer it and reproduce it. So this became the battle. And it turned out that after this came out, all these other products started to say, wow, if DVDs can protect people accessing them, I'm making garage door openers. I can make it so no one can interoperate with
Right.
mine, because it'll have this secret algorithm that is encrypted, and only I have the key. And so the hacker community saw this, say, wait a minute, this trend is really bad. Basically, everything's going to have a software component in the future.
Yep.
Everything is going to be covered by DMCA, and we're not going to be able to figure out how anything works. And so people fought for this to be an exception to DMCA. So the exception is if you're doing bona fide security research, you're allowed to break the encryption. You still can't make an interoperable product, but at least you can find vulnerabilities in this stuff and call snake oil snake oil. So to me, that's some progress. If something has a whole bunch of vulnerabilities in it, and then they encrypt it, and then they say, hey, but no one can access those vulnerabilities because they'd be breaking the law to be able to understand where they were. And we basically, this is, well, that's a ridiculous argument. People should be able to understand where the vulnerabilities are at least.
Well, another thing that you mentioned to me, we were talking about doing this interview, was the overlap in mentality between lockpicking and hacking. And it's true. I'm recently come to the hacker scene, but every place I've gone, there's been a lockpick village. I mean, you go to the hacking things, and somewhere this dedicated area where people thankfully bring in a whole bunch of really cool and tricky locks. Some of them lucite, you can actually see through it and see what you're doing, and help you learn to pick locks. I learned to pick locks at one of my first hacker conferences, which was a lot of fun. So what is it about hacking and lockpicking that are so closely related? And is lockpicking something that anybody can learn to do?
Yeah, so I love the way that sort of, and I call it open source lockpicking, just because to distinguish it from sort of the lockpicking that the locksmith guilds had from many years ago, where only people who were sort of certified and had a certificate and were sort of in the guild got access to the information and the tools, versus what really started happening in the early 90s, like around 1990 at MIT, where they actually had a lockpicking club and they had a lockpicking guide, and they published this, right? You could go to back then, an FTP server and download the lockpicking guide. So a lot of the mentality of hacking systems and software is parallel in the lockpicking world, because a lot of the times there are design weaknesses, and there's also implementation weaknesses. Like if you look at a 5-pin tumbler lock, which most people have on their front door of their house, a Yale lock, invented by Yale back in the early 1800s. We still use it today. They're very inexpensively made. And inside there's a bunch of little pins that each correspond to those little, little depths in your key. As you push the key in, you feel it hitting those pins and raising those pins up to a certain point where if the pins match the key, it opens the lock. And so design-wise, yeah, that's pretty good. But implementation-wise, it has problems because the pins aren't perfectly cylindrical. Right? It's hard to make an object that small out of brass that is that high, super high tolerance, especially when you're trying to make the lock for $10. And so these implementation defects end up making some of the pins bigger than others and wider than others. And you can start to get to this point where one pin will move before the other pins when you put, the lock pick in. If you're doing a file cabinet, you can use a bobby pin. But you really need a lockpick for a 5-pin. And I think anyone can do this after they've practiced a few times. So what the sort of the metaphor to computer security is, every lock has vulnerabilities. Cheaper locks where a lot of care wasn't put into the implementation, or they just didn't care. They're like, hey, I got to make it at this price point. are going to have more vulnerabilities and are going to be easier to pick. And it's something that everyone can do with the right knowledge and tools. And so it's really the hacker way of looking at the world. So I think that, this is one of the things I wish I could, go back and meet some of the guys who wrote the lock picking guide at MIT. Their way of looking at the world was a reverse engineering way of looking at the world. And also, once you figured something out, you wanted to share that information with other people so they could use that information. And you also wanted to look at that information to say, what can be improved? How can now that this information is out there, can someone else make a lock that doesn't have this problem? And how would that happen? And that's exactly what hackers do with we could say ethical hackers or white hat hackers do with computer security. Is once they reverse engineer and find something, they don't keep it to themselves and just use it to exploit someone and steal their data. They share that information, maybe put it into a tool like we did at L0pht with L0pht Crack, so everyone can use that quote exploit and understand if their system is vulnerable to it, or share it with the manufacturer so the manufacturer can eliminate that vulnerability. And so it's that open exchange of knowledge around locks, which is very similar to digital systems.
Well, I managed to catch a keynote you just did at Blue Hat, which was I think just a couple months ago, maybe even just last month. It was pretty recent. I found it was online, and in it you talked about this notion of securing your product by breaking into it, which is what you're talking about here. But a lot has changed since the 90s. Not only has the technological landscape changed, but the legal landscape has changed too. So today we have even, formalized pen testing, which is a thing now, which the groups like the L0pht help lay the groundwork for, and bug bounty programs and things like that. So in your mind, is it easier or harder to be a hacker today than it was back in the old days? And is the original hacker culture and ethos still alive anywhere today? Can it be? I mean, does it make sense?
So, I think that it's harder to hack the sort of the more mature technologies where people have understood the importance of those things being secure and have had time to do all the things you do with a secure by design process, to design in security. So if you look at like the Chrome browser, that's so much harder to hack than Internet Explorer was in 1998, even though it's doing the exact same thing, right? It's surfing the web, it's rendering HTML. The modern iPhone is so much harder to hack than the early days of smartphones and the BlackBerry and some of these different the myriad of Nokia products and all these different things. So there are areas that have matured and we rely on, and I'm glad that those are harder to hack. But there's no lack of things that are easy to hack, right? Because there's always a new company doing a new software. There's always a new technology. And people, when they first create something and they're a startup and they're building something new, they don't know whether it's going to be successful or not, right? And they can't spend the time and energy to secure things. So I like to call this, you go into security debt. You're like, well, if it becomes popular, I'll start, fixing all my bugs, or I'll start looking for them. So I think there's always something interesting to hack, whether it's a toy or a new device or a new piece of software, a new plugin or something like that. But I think we are getting more secure in general. I think the tide is lifting all the boats. But yeah, no, you can definitely go out there and hack something just starting from scratch. The fun is still out there.
I remember one of the comments I think that was made at the either Blue Hat or the DEF CON panel, where someone was saying that the browsers have got so much stronger that today it's a lot of chaining of attacks, chaining of exploits and vulnerabilities. Whereas you used to stumble upon stuff back in the day because they were everywhere. Like bugs were all over the place because they weren't really ironed out yet. But we've come a long way, and so now a lot of the things we have to chain together. But on the flip side, it seems like things have gotten so much more complex, and we keep adding more and more features to things, even when they don't need them. Like Microsoft Word could have stopped development 10 years ago and it would be perfectly usable today, but they keep adding features in it. And now AI is in everything. And they keep adding the stuff to, I guess, get people to buy new versions of products. But it seems to be that complexity is really working at odds with security. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Complexity, some people would say, is the enemy of security, because it becomes increasingly difficult to understand the security properties of the system. Instead of reverse engineering, this one contained area, you're reverse engineering 50 things that it all interacts with. And it becomes really hard to understand the security of the system. The other thing that is complexity is there's this complexity that things are constantly changing over time. It used to be that, you shipped something and it was just this one thing, but now it's interacting with things, real time, online, and then the code itself is constantly changing, with DevOps. Like every single day, there's a new opportunity for a developer to create a security bug and push that to production, right? Yeah. There's every single day, there's a new open source vulnerability discovered in a library that 1,000 different products are using, and all of a sudden, all of those are vulnerable. So there's a complexity in the system, but the threat landscape constantly changing, with code constantly changing, and known vulnerabilities constantly popping up that affect you, makes it very difficult. It makes security like a real time endeavor. You're just absolutely never done maintaining the security of your system. It's the opposite of static. It's extremely dynamic.
All right. Well, while I've got you here, I'm really curious to get your take on something that's kind of happened recently, even though it's really just a callback, honestly, to the crypto wars of the 90s. And that is, there's been, ever since 9/11 and maybe since Snowden, we've certainly been of the understanding that law enforcement and intelligence agencies and things have still been, decrying going dark and how encryption is keeping them from doing everything. But it's really, to me, it seems like it's really heating up in the last few years with Western democracies. Governments are trying to outlaw some of these things. And recently it was released, Washington Post said that the UK, under their Snoopers Charter, has been basically directed Apple that you must give us access to your encrypted cloud storage stuff, their advanced data protection. So it seems like the crypto war is all over again. We thought this was done, but what do you think the outcome is going to be this time around? And can we do anything about it?
Yeah. So, I think that's quite shocking that, the UK government is asking Apple that, and it's worldwide too. Like, so if they're investigating someone in Pakistan, they're like, oh, and this person too. So I think it's pretty far reaching. That obviously has to be scoped down somewhat, but I'm hopeful it doesn't go anywhere. And the flip side of it is we actually have had the US government through CISA saying, you should be using a secure messenger, like,
After
SMS
Salt Typhoon,
is not cutting it. And you probably should be like, doing secure voice communications, not using regular phone calls.
That was very interesting.
They targeted it at like high at-risk individuals, but like they didn't define what that means. What does that mean? Is the CEO of a company a high-risk individual? Okay, so like CEOs should be using Signal and, for voice and text or some other encrypted tool. Where does that end? Where does that end? I know that they're advising government employees to use those tools. So on one side, there's a realization that nation states are putting businesses and the government at risk by being able to snoop on communications that can be snooped on. On the other side, you have nation states saying, we need to snoop on things. And both sides of the argument are playing out at the nation state level. So I don't think there's really any resolution. They're going to keep asking for access to stuff, but people are going to keep encrypting their stuff. I think, the crypto wars are just going to keep going. It's almost an unresolved problem.
Well, the two things that always come back to this, and because I fully understand our need to investigate crimes and to stop bad guys, and there obviously are really horrible things that happen on this planet that we would like the people that are charged with protecting us to be able to stop before they happen, if possible, and certainly prosecute after the fact. But there's no, and backdoor is such a pejorative term now, but there's no, we'll call it what it is. There's no backdoor that only good guys can go through. And second of all, at the end of the day, the bad guys are still going to figure out a way to get this stuff done. And then, the phrase I tried out recently was, if you outlaw encryption, then only outlaws are going to have encryption. Isn't really the whole thing almost kind of pointless? Isn't it better for us all to have better defense than to try to have privileged access for law enforcement.
Yes, I absolutely agree that we all should have better defense. I think at one of the very first talks I went to on cryptography at MIT, Ron Rivest, who's probably one of the most famous cryptographers in the world, he's the R in RSA, said, we don't outlaw gloves because they hide fingerprints, because gloves have so many benefits to society, right? They protect our hands from getting cut. They keep us warm. And yes, they thwart fingerprinting. So what do detectives need to do? They need to not rely solely on fingerprinting. They need other things too, right? So I think the same goes for encrypted data. It has so many benefits from keeping criminals from accessing things, hostile nation states from accessing things, that we have to think of it as the benefits outweigh the downsides. And we should focus on, if people are really doing criminal activity, let's think of other ways to stop them. Now, I think a lot of the stuff that was exposed in the Snowden leaks was showing how NSA was doing things like hiding things in mice and stuff like that, so that they could actually go after criminals from their endpoints. That's a lot harder than just being able to access the encrypted data, but it's not impossible. So I think that's where the focus should be on what are those investigative techniques that we can look at fingerprints of things that are, signatures of communication to maybe identify individuals, but not be able to just go, hey, I want all the encrypted and safe data that this person thought they had to be decrypted.
Yeah. All right. So as we wrap up here, I want to give you kind of a blanket opening here. What's something that people get wrong about L0pht and, or maybe just kind of the early hacking days? What's, maybe something that's myth that wasn't really true. And so is there any part of the record that you'd like to set straight? Here's your opportunity.
Yeah. So I think one of the threads that really kind of ran through, because we made it public that we talked to Richard Clarke and that we did testify at the Senate, was that, we were working with the FBI, right? There was rumors that, we had FBI handlers and that, we were telling the FBI, we were informants,
wow,
right? From the underground to the FBI. And it isn't like we never spoke with any FBI agents. Like sometimes we would run into them and they'd know we were from the L0pht and they'd want to ask us questions. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And that was, I think, one of the things that the L0pht really did was we bridged these different worlds so that we could talk about cybersecurity. And it didn't matter if you were at the government or you were in academia, you were at a vendor, you're an independent hacker. And if someone really honestly wanted to learn something and had a real need for information about how something worked, we didn't care. This is where the whole gray hat came from. Like, we don't want to be black or white. We don't want to think about, who we're getting the information from or who we're giving it to. If that's facts, it's how something works. Let's talk about it. So it wasn't like we wouldn't talk with the FBI, but we certainly weren't informants. As far as I know, I don't know what people do in their personal lives, but as far as I know, no one at the L0pht was doing anything like that. And I think it played into this whole, well, they were doing that and then they became sellouts, right? Because they went and started a company, and that's stake, like, right? We went and joined up with At Stake and helped bring At Stake to life. So, I think that every garage band wants to get the record deal, right? And we can all say, well, how commercial was that record deal? Was it a big company or a little grungy company? And then you're talking shades of gray of selling out, right? You're not just playing for your fans at the local bar. You're trying to spread your music around the world, and really the only way to get that is distribution. And so L0pht wanted to spread our ethos for figuring out how to secure things by breaking into them. A way to do that is to start a company and teach a whole bunch of consultants and sell those services to software companies. And I see that as making the world a more secure place, a place that I couldn't do just by publishing articles and talking online. And then, even at stake, I don't feel like Dildog and I were like, this isn't going far enough. Like, just giving the tools to consultants is not working. So we started a company, Veracode, to bring this technology to the masses. Anyone who writes software, whether you're a bank writing software for your ATM, or you're a small startup company writing, some online website, we'll help you secure that. So the whole selling out thing was another thing that it's just a way to put a pejorative on just sort of exposing more people to your ideas.
Well, and I think a lot of people come up with this when they start getting, maybe quote unquote famous, is when you get the chance to operate from the inside. You could sometimes do a lot more from the inside than you could do from the outside, but there's room for both, right? I mean, you need that tension. You need to work at it from both angles. So I think so as a wrap up, that kind of segues perfectly into my question is, where does everybody now? Like, they were some of the original folks. Help us understand where they are now, where you are now. Tell us a little bit about Veracode and what you're doing there. Do you guys get together and hang out? What's it like? Catch us up on how things have evolved with your group over the years.
Yeah, sure. So, it is kind of a diaspora now. Dildog, Christian Ryu, we worked together at Veracode. I think he left after I think about 12 years. Like, Veracode is now getting on 19 years old. He left after 12 years. So we had worked together up until that point. But I think today, everyone's different places doing very different things. Some people do IT security at banks and insurance companies. Mudge is working at DARPA, so he's working at the government again. Joe Grand has his own independent business where he builds and breaks, hardware. Famously made the DEF CON badges for many, many years. And, I'm still here. I'm still here at Veracode, and I feel like I'm sort of still on the same mission, which is to help people build secure software, to understand that unless you actually think about building things secure by design, you're going to end up with something that attackers are going to be able to compromise, and your customers are not going to be happy. So, still here at Veracode, things have changed. Technology keeps changing. We have to keep coming up with new ways of analyzing software, new ways of helping developers build securely, because development processes keep changing, deployment keeps changing. So it's yes, we're still sort of doing the same thing, securing software, but it's very different when you talk about people doing DevOps and using AI code generation and downloading. 3/4 of their software is made with open source libraries, which have malicious backdoors in some of them. The environment of building software and securing that requires a lot different technology than it did, 18 years ago. So it's still a very interesting problem, and I'm still enjoying trying to help my customers build secure software.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for doing this. I'm glad we finally got together. Thanks for coming on the show, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Kerry. This has been a blast.
That was a lot of fun. If you can't tell, I love to get into the hacker history stuff. I will endeavor to get as many more folks on the show as I can. I've already floated this idea with, some folks from the Cult of the Dead Cow and some other folks from L0pht. So hopefully that will happen. And I would love to get some other groups represented as well. So one thing that came out of this for me that was interesting, and this is probably going to have limited appeal, but I'll throw it out there just in case, is back in the day, I was actually an electrical engineer by degree. So I was going to Purdue University and I was a co-op student, which meant that every other semester, I would go work for a company to get hands-on experience with, electrical engineering kind of stuff. And I actually worked for a rather large company at the time that did Department of Defense work. And I was working on some digital, electronic circuits design there. I had a secret clearance actually at the time, not top secret, just regular secret. And when you're dealing with electronics, there's companies and representatives coming to your building, to talk about products. When you want to buy stuff from them, you have meetings with them, and you have contacts with them. And one of the things that you collected, because they were just like gold back in the day, if you were in EE, were these what we call data books. And as we were talking about, dumpster diving for documentation, my mind flashed back to these books, and I had dozens of these books, and I collected them. And again, it was almost like this, for my personal engineering library. And they were from Texas Instruments and Burr Brown and Motorola, National Semiconductor. They were both analog and digital, but there were books on TTL parts and CMOS parts. And I know I'm kind of, this is all geeky stuff, but as I was trying to remember what some of these things were, I went to ChatGPT and gave it a prompt and said, I'm trying to remember what some of these things were. Can you help me? And not only did it help me remember some of these cool old data books and some of the companies behind them, but it pointed me to a website called bitsavers.org. And I just couldn't believe the amount of nostalgic, geeky documentation that was being maintained on this site. So if anything I just talked about, if you're of a certain age and had experience in some of that geeky stuff, go check out bitsavers.org. There's a lot of really interesting references there. Also, Weld talks about the MIT lockpicking guide. You can get that online. It is available in PDF form. There's a link to that in the show notes. It's very interesting. You can also, by the way, get yourself a lockpicking kit with like clear Lucite locks, so you can actually see what's going on inside the lock while you're trying to pick it, which is a great way to learn how to pick locks. You don't have to be like a licensed locksmith to order and use these things. So if you're interested, any Google search will turn that up. And of course, I also have links to some of the L0pht stuff. And if you want to see their Congressional testimony video, I've got a link to that, as well as the DEF CON 26 reunion panel, which was also interesting to watch. So all that is in the show notes and more. Check that out. On Thursday, as usual, patrons will be getting their bonus content, the extra Q&A with the guest. We talk about L0pht root beer, of all things. We talk a little bit about what it's like to have a hacker handle and sort of a secret identity and, an alter ego, and how that, kind of works and plays out in real life. A little bit more hacker history stuff, including they were part of, I guess briefly, a MTV documentary on hackers. And so that's a funny story. And then we even talk about like software liability and a few other more serious topics. So anyway, the patrons will get that bonus content as usual on Thursday. I've got so many shows coming up, and they're all just amazing. I've already pre-recorded several of them. We'll be talking with cybersecurity defense specialist Oz Jones, fellow privacy and security advocate Josh Summers from All Things Secured. Lisa Lavasser from Internet Safety Labs is doing some really great work. Those are all recorded and will be coming soon. I also have several on the books. I'll be talking with Bruce and Heidi Potter, the founders of ShmooCon, Debbie Reynolds, the Data Diva, Zach Edwards, who will speak about the fallout from the recent Gravy Analytics breach. He's been the source for a lot of articles about that and more. But on top of all of that, I also have booked or am very close to booking interviews with two top friends of the show that I can't wait to bring back, including Cory Doctorow and Josh Corman from I Am the Cavalry and many, many other things. So as usual, I will just say, just go subscribe to the podcast, and that way you will get all of that stuff. All right, we got a new show for you next week. Plenty of things to talk about. Again, if you want to get the more urgent cybersecurity and/or privacy news, follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter /X, Mastodon, and Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. If you go to fdsd.me/contact, you will find all of the links to that stuff there. If you want the more urgent stuff, the things that are more pressing, that since my news shows are only every 2 weeks, most of that stuff that I talk about in the new shows ends up being retrospective. If you want to be a little more plugged in, I do post more urgent stuff on social media. All right, that'll do it, everybody. Take care, stay safe out there, and until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.